So, so the meditation has come to an end, and now we're going to start the class. But during the class, still try to be aware of what your mind is doing, and if your mind wanders away, go somewhere else. Try to bring it back. So in other words, try to stay concentrated or attentive. Have you heard this? There's this explanation. It comes in the Lamrim, the stages of the path, about the right state of mind one should have when listening to teachings, using the analogy of the vessel, 3 types of vessel.
Yeah.
You heard of that one? Do you remember them?
The one that it goes through, but it has a hole and it comes out.
Leaky vessel, right. So like this cup, you know, it can be used to hold tea or water or whatever, but if it has a hole in the bottom, then whatever goes in will just go out. So we should try to avoid being like that. Or like we say in English, it goes in one ear and out the other. You don't remember anything. So that's one. Another one?
Full one.
No, it's upside down. Right, so if the cup is upside down, then nothing goes in at all. So that means having a mind that's just not here, not attentive, not focused. It's like your body is here, but your mind is somewhere else. You know that one? Has that ever happened to you? Well, I mean, it's understandable if there's some big problems going on in your life or something you have to do tomorrow and you're really worried about. So it's natural your mind is going to be going to that. But just try to be aware, and when that does happen, try to put aside that other object and say, okay, I'll deal with that later. Right now, I'm here and I'm going to pay attention to what's going on. So in other words, just pay attention, be concentrated. And the third one? Huh?
Dirty cup.
Dirty, yeah. So if the cup is full of slime and yucky stuff, and whatever goes into it's going to be disgusting. You don't want to drink it. So in a similar way, that's like having a mind that's kind of polluted with unwholesome, unskillful attitudes, such as not having the right motivation. Yeah, worldly motivation. I want to learn emptiness so that I can become a famous teacher, write books, make a lot of money, become famous. I mean, some people do think that way. It's not impossible. I have met some and heard of some. So anyway, that's not the right state of mind that one should have. Another one might be, you know, wanting to thinking that you already know a lot about emptiness and wanting to check out the teacher. Okay, I'm going to see, does she really know this? And, you know, I'm like trying to look for mistakes and then, you know, point out mistakes, faults, or whatever. So that's also not a helpful state of mind to have. I mean, it's good to, of course, you know, we're told we should doubt and we should question, we should ask questions and so on, but having that kind of attitude, you know, trying to find fault with a teacher, fault with the teachings isn't really so helpful. We're having this old problem again. Microphone falling down. What is, we put something there last time.
Balance. We all need balance.
Yeah. So anyway, the point there is our motivation for being here, listening to the teaching, should be a positive one. So we already, you know, started off thinking about what is the right motivation and tried to generate that. So really try to maintain that motivation, that I want to learn about emptiness so that I can develop myself along the spiritual path and get higher and higher, working towards enlightenment so that I can benefit others. That's the real purpose, is benefiting others, not just me. Of course, we'll benefit too, but it's good to go beyond self-centeredness. Okay, so we started last time looking at this handout that I prepared for you. Any extra copies? So, can anyone say why emptiness is important? Why is it an important subject to learn about, and think about, and try to understand? Is that your hand up, or you're just stretching? Okay.
My name is Leora.
Sorry?
Leora. My name.
Oh, your name is there. Okay.
I think that it's important to understand what is the emptiness, because then we will realize that what we see is not the real reality. It's a false reality, and there is another reality which we can't see that. Everything that we see is a projection of us, and we have to understand emptiness to see it. And if we will understand emptiness, we will be able to reach enlightenment.
Yes, that's very good. Thank you. Right. So, any other comments? Any other additions?
Yes,
Okay.
like what she said, that emptiness is the antidote for ignorance. And ignorance is, because of this, all the problems arise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so that's really important to understand that we have suffering. There's a lot of suffering. Each one of us has suffering. Everybody else in the world has suffering. And where does all this suffering come from? Or why is there suffering? So it's mainly because of ignorance, not understanding the true nature of things, how things really are. What's that?
It's mine.
Okay, mindfulness bell. So understanding emptiness is the antidote to ignorance, and therefore the antidote to suffering. It's like the medicine, we could say, the ultimate medicine that heals all the suffering in ourselves, all the suffering in the world. So, I mean, of course, we have to start with ourselves and develop an understanding of emptiness in our own minds, and in that way we can gradually clear away ignorance and other disturbing emotions like anger, hatred, greed, jealousy. So gradually get rid of those, make our minds more clear and pure and eventually enlightened. That's the ultimate goal. And the more we can do that with ourselves, with our own mind, the more we will be able to help others to do the same. We'll be able to help them to have less ignorance, less suffering, less confusion, and more peace and happiness.
How can we help others to be less ignorant?
Well, I mean, we teach them. Of course, they're not always interested. If they're not interested in learning from us, then it's a little more difficult. But I also feel that by our example, I think teaching by example is a very powerful way to help others. So if we ourselves can live according to these teachings and be more loving and more compassionate, non-violent, not selfish, not greedy. So try to live a more healthy and wholesome way of life ourselves and have these positive qualities in ourselves, even without saying anything to others. Some people at least will notice that and probably be impressed by that and want to become that way themselves. I mean, I've heard, for example, they say scientists say that kindness is contagious. I guess there's research showing that one person doing acts of kindness will influence others to do acts of kindness. So it's probably the same with all the other positive qualities. Compassion. generosity and ethics and so on. So each person who can practice these, live these in their lives, will have an effect on others. And then, of course, if people are interested and do want to learn, and you have the understanding, then you can explain it to them. So there's all kinds of ways of helping others overcome ignorance. But you know, we have to work on ourselves. We have to walk the talk. We have to, you know, be a living example or living embodiment of these teachings. So it's not that we're going on street corners and, you know, preaching to people and trying to push them to understand emptiness. That won't work. But the Buddha always said, as I understand it, the Buddha said, you know, we shouldn't teach people unless they are interested.
Right.
You know, people have to be interested, they have to ask, they have to want to know, and then you can teach them. But you shouldn't sort of try to be pushy about it and teach them when they're not interested. That's not skillful. It's not the Buddhist way. So anyway, helping others. So we need an understanding of emptiness in order to be free of suffering for ourselves, to liberate ourselves from suffering, and to reach enlightenment, and then be able to help others be free of suffering as well. So it's an antidote to suffering. And then, I'm not going to repeat everything we looked at last week. You can read it yourself on the handout, but the next point was the lineage of teachings. Where do these teachings come from? And the main source is a collection of sutras called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. The Heart Sutra we read in the beginning is one of those sutras, but there are others. Some are really long, really, really long. And in those sutras, we find the teachings on emptiness. So that's the origin. So it comes from the sutras of the Buddha. And then over the centuries after the Buddha passed away, various masters, Indian masters, you know, transmitted these teachings and also clarified them, wrote commentaries and so on to clarify the meaning. So some of those masters are Nagarjuna, he's one of the famous ones, and Chandrakirti and Shantideva. So they are some of the great masters of the Indian tradition that passed on the teachings of emptiness. And then eventually they came to Tibet, and Tibetan masters took them up. And then in our tradition, the Gelugpa tradition, Lama Tsongkhapa, you know, great scholar, meditator, and he also wrote a lot of texts. So he wrote a number of texts on the subject of emptiness. So that's how we get them, because our teachers follow the traditional Lama Tsongkhapa. So we can thank all those great masters for keeping these teachings alive, and not just words, not just the words, but you know, they meditated on them and gained the realization, so they could pass down, you know, the actual experience of the wisdom of emptiness. And also emptiness, the teachings on emptiness are the part of the wisdom side of the path, and then the other side of the path is the compassion side. So these two are often compared to the wings of a bird, which you've probably heard that analogy. Just like a bird needs two wings to fly, we need these two wings of wisdom, understanding the true nature of things, and compassion, having this kind-hearted caring for others and wanting to help others and so on. So those two are the most important features of the path to enlightenment. And then letter C, I put down the two truths here, but I don't think I spent much time talking about them last time. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often says that the way to learn Buddhism, like for those of us who are not born into a Buddhist family in a Buddhist country and so on, but come to Buddhism later in our life, in our 20s or 30s or whatever. So we're newly learning Buddhism, which we didn't learn before. So he has said that the best way to start off learning Buddhism is with the Four Noble Truths, which is the very first thing the Buddha taught, the Four Noble Truths, and the Two Truths. So this is his recommendation. And the Four Noble Truths are not too difficult to understand. What are the Four Noble Truths?
There is suffering, the truth about suffering and the causes for suffering, the truth about being able to eliminate the suffering, and the truth about the path.
Very good. Okay. So the Four Noble Truths, you know, in one way it's kind of simple, we can get some understanding of it, but it's also very profound. I mean, we could keep learning about, hearing teachings on, meditating on the Four Noble Truths for our whole life, because, you know, when you go into the real depth of them, they're quite profound. But it said that everything the Buddha taught can be contained in the Four Noble Truths. It's a sort of summary of the main teachings that the Buddha gave, that there is suffering. Suffering has causes. It's possible to eliminate the causes of suffering and therefore eliminate suffering. And there's a path, a way to do it, a way to get there. Okay? So that kind of summarizes the main message of the Buddha. And then the Two Truths, it's more difficult to understand the Two Truths. Conventional truths and ultimate truths. And also one further difficulty is that there are different ways of explaining the Two Truths. So within Buddhism, if you go down the next box down, letter D, Four Buddhist Systems of Philosophy. So these four schools have different ways of explaining things, such as the Two Truths. So they don't all explain them in the same way. And when we study with our Tibetan teachers, so if you're studying with Tibetan teachers or you're reading books about Tibetan Buddhism, it's usually, most of the time, from the point of view of the last of the four schools, which is Madhyamika. And within Madhyamika, there are two divisions. So it's the last of those, which is the Madhyamika Prasangika, or the middle way consequentialists. So that's the school that the Tibetans like the best. And not that they like it, I mean, they think it's the most accurate, the most correct, the most high as well. So that's the one they usually explain. But there are these other schools. And if you ever get together with Buddhists from other traditions, Zen or Theravada or whatever, and you start talking about things, you'll probably quickly discover that they're not on the same page. They have different views of things. But it's also very interesting. So there is a kind of class, I guess you could say, or a course for studying these four systems and, you know, comparing them. And it's very interesting. If you have a chance to study that. Maybe one day Shantideva will have a course in that. It's not easy. It's not easy, but it's very, very interesting.
I think they study it in the basic program.
Yeah, it's one of the subjects in the basic program. Yeah. Huh?
So
We will have it one day, yes. So just quickly, just to give you some idea, the first two schools are called Hinayana Schools. And so those two schools, their main focus or their main aim or goal is the attainment of nirvana, liberation. So people who follow those schools, that's what they're aiming for. I want to get myself out of suffering, out of samsara. I want to get myself to nirvana. And there are differences between these two schools, so I won't go into that. But both of these two schools say that there are objectively existing things. So like the external world, the world that we see around us of, you know, buildings, tables, chairs, people, cars, trees, mountains, oceans, and so on. So all that stuff we see out there really exists, just as it appears to us. It's really objectively existing. It's made up of little particles of matter, you know, tiny, tiny particles, but they're like, it's kind of like Newtonian physics, I think, that there are these tiny particles which are the basic building blocks of everything else. They can't be broken down any further. So this is what these schools believe. There's these tiny, tiny little particles which can't be broken down any further, and they come together and make bigger objects, and they're really there, and we just come along and see them, you know, with our mind, with our senses. So things exist out there objectively. But in spite of that, I mean, they also talk about impermanence and how, you know, all these things which seem very solid and permanent are not. So again, it's more like quantum physics, that things are changing every moment, right? They don't stay the same from one moment to the next. So this is what we call subtle impermanence, and that's actually very profound. If we could get an understanding of that, it would really have a big effect on our mind and our emotions. We wouldn't get so angry, so attached, and so on, if we could really see that nothing stays the same from one moment to the next. And then with the mind, they also say the mind exists objectively. It's also impermanent, changing every moment, not the same from one moment to the next. So the mind is also made up of tiny little, not physical particles, but moments of mind, moments of experience that, you know, come and go, come and go, come and go, like that. And so the mind is also impermanent, changing all the time, but it's still objectively existing. It's a real thing. And then, for them, the most important thing to meditate on, the main object of meditation, is selflessness. Now, the term selflessness and the term emptiness are often used interchangeably. So I used to get confused about this. I'll write them on the board just to make it more kind of concrete. Is this readable? Yeah. Can you read it?
Yeah. Emptiness equals...
Yeah. So roughly, I mean, sometimes there may be differences, but I'm just saying that because if you come across those two terms, just to understand, they're basically the same. So sometimes they say selflessness, sometimes they say emptiness, but roughly they are the same. So in these two schools, Hinayana Schools, in order to attain nirvana, liberation, become free of suffering, what one needs to realize is selflessness. And it's selflessness of persons as opposed to selflessness of phenomena. So if you turn on page 2, about a third of the way down, letter F, it says 2 types of selflessness or emptiness. So selflessness of persons is the first one. Selflessness of persons. So this means selflessness or emptiness with regard to persons, like oneself, me, I, and everybody else, including Buddhas. So Buddha is also selfless or empty. So all kinds of beings. So person just means being, you know, living being. And so this is asserted by all 4 Buddhist systems. So all 4 Buddhist schools talk about this selflessness of persons. The number 2 is selflessness of phenomena. So here, phenomena means things other than persons. So that would be like chairs and tables and cushions and tankas and buildings and cars and everything. Also minds. So everything that isn't a person. So all other things besides persons. So, so one can also talk about selflessness or emptiness with regard to those phenomena. And this type of selflessness is asserted only by the two Mahayana systems. So the two Hinayana systems, which I've mentioned just now, don't talk about selflessness of phenomena. They only talk about selflessness of persons.
How come?
Good question. And also, this is the way it's explained by the Gelugpa tradition. Now, if you went to a Hinayana school and said, well, do you talk about selflessness of persons? I don't know. They might say, well, yes, we do. And then they may explain it. But yeah, this is how it's explained by the Gelugpa. When the Gelugpa school is looking at these four schools, this is how they explain it. Yeah, that's all. That's as much as I can say about that. But like I said, according to these first two schools, they say that phenomena, like material phenomena and minds and so forth, exist objectively. They have, they really exist out there as they appear. So they don't go into analysis of that. They don't kind of do a very careful analysis of how things exist, as the Mahayana schools do. So if we go to the Mahayana schools, the first school is called Chittamatra, and that means mind-only school. And they have a very interesting explanation. It's almost the opposite to the first two schools. First two schools say there's a real world out there existing objectively. But this school, the mind-only school, says no, there's no real world out there at all. It's all in the mind. That's why they're called mind-only. Okay? And all of these schools, they do have their bases in things that the Buddha said. Okay, so there are actual statements in the Buddha's sutras where he said things like that, that everything is created by the mind, for example. Everything is created by the mind. So they took that very literally, and they say, for example, this tanka here, it looks like there's a tanka outside of our mind hanging there on the wall, but in fact, the tanka that we see is just projected by our mind. So the way they explain it, they explain a special kind of mind, which is called the alaya vijnana, or it's translated as the mind basis of all. Sometimes it's called a storehouse consciousness. So it's a type of mind, one type of mind, which functions like a container or a storehouse. So all the imprints, all the things we've ever seen or experienced, or the actions we've done, all the imprints of our experiences are stored there in that storehouse consciousness. I'll call it storehouse consciousness to keep it easy. And then when causes and conditions come together, one of those imprints arises or ripens and causes this experience of, like, when we see the tanka, we have an eye consciousness, a visual consciousness, seeing this tanka. So both the eye consciousness seeing the tanka and the tanka itself are coming from the mind, the ripening of an imprint that causes that appearance. And what are you going to ask, Tal?
Something that seems logical to me. So how do they explain? Do they explain that we all have the same store consciousness?
Yeah. Right. No, we all have the same imprint. So how many of us, 25 people of us in this room, so we have a common imprint because of some common experience in the past to be able to see this tanka. However, they would say, and this is right, it's actually true, you know, that if you really analyze carefully, it's still falling down. If you really analyze carefully, you will see that not everybody sees things in exactly the same way, right? I mean, some people might look at this tanka and feel happy. Oh, it's beautiful. Another person might look at it and feel frightened or threatened or angry, right? So there are differences in the way that we see things. Yeah, and also this may be a source or an origin for this school's viewpoint, because I think it was mentioned in the sutras. If you have like a glass of liquid, okay, let's say it's just water, clear, pure water. So us human beings see water, right? We see clean, clear, drinkable water. But if a hungry ghost, you know hungry ghosts? Hungry, miserable, suffering beings. Okay, so the hungry ghost was in the room and looked at that glass of water. What they would see would be something really disgusting, like blood, pus, something yucky, because of their karma. This is how it's explained. They don't have the karma to see clean, clear, pure water. Okay, so even though they're dying of thirst, they cannot find nice, clean water to drink. They find just yucky, disgusting things to drink. But they're desperate, so they'll drink anything. So even though it's the same stuff, but because of karma, it is perceived differently by different beings. And then if you take another kind of being, a deva, these are the beings higher than us in the heavens. So if a deva came along and looked at this liquid, they would see something, wow, like ambrosia, just divine and blissful and delicious, and just looking at it or smelling it or tasting it would bring bliss to the mind. So again, that's because of their karma. So the liquid in the cup is the same. It doesn't change. But because of the karma of the being, they will see it in a different way. Okay, so this is hard for us to maybe relate to, because maybe we're not even sure if there are these other beings like pratas and devas. But this is something that comes, I think it comes in the sutras. So they use that as an example of how there isn't an objective reality out there. If there was an objectively existing liquid in that cup, everybody would see it the same, but that isn't the case. So that shows that things are not objectively existing out there, but they come from the mind. They're projected by the mind. So, lots of questions, huh? Maybe can we save them for later?
Yeah.
Hang on to them and we'll take care of them later. So that school then does talk about emptiness with regard to phenomena, selflessness or emptiness with regard to phenomena other than persons. And the way they explain it is, like the liquid in the cup, we could say, it's empty of existing externally, meaning it doesn't exist as something external to the mind, existing, separate from the mind, but it's just arising from the mind, projected by the mind. So that's their version of emptiness, of phenomena. It's difficult, yeah. I mean, I'm just giving a brief explanation of it here.
Is it going to be on the test?
No, don't worry.
Thank you for the question, darling.
But the thing is, it's really useful to go progressively through these different schools because they become more and more subtle as you go along. And then by the time you get to Madhyamika Prasangika, the highest one, the most difficult one, your mind is better able to handle it. Whereas most of the time, if you just go to Tibetan teachings or you read Tibetan books, they throw you straight away into the Madhyamika Prasangika, you know, and expect you to be able to understand it. Well, maybe they don't expect that, but anyway, that's the one that they present, and it's really hard compared to the others. So it is helpful to go through the others. So then, and then Madhyamika, the fourth school. Madhyamika means middle way. So one reason it's called middle way is because the two Hinayana schools are sort of one extreme. This is something Geshe Kelsang Wangmo was talking about the other day. That's a nice expression, a nice explanation. The two Hinayana schools are one extreme in the sense that things exist objectively in a real solid way out there. And then the Chittamatra, the mind-only school, is kind of the other extreme. There's nothing out there at all. It's only the mind. So these are kind of like two extremes. Whereas the middle way, they don't agree with the Chittamatra. They say there are things that exist out there, but not in the same way that the two Hinayana schools do. Yeah, they're not as sort of objectively existing. They don't exist in that way. But they do exist out there. Also, one thing about the mind-only school is that they say the external world doesn't exist objectively, but the mind is truly existing. The mind is real. So they attribute, you know, real and true existence to the mind. And that's something that the Madhyamika don't agree with. They say that no, the mind too is empty of true existence. So the Madhyamika school, their version of emptiness is emptiness of true existence. Emptiness of existing truly, or we could say objectively, things existing completely 100% on their own from their own side. So that's their version of emptiness in general. But then there are two divisions of Madhyamika, which maybe we won't go into because it gets complicated. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm making things more confusing by just giving a little brief explanation like this, but it's just, the point I'm trying to make is that within Buddhists, within Buddhism, there are different points of view. Not all Buddhists explain things in the same way. So we usually, in the Tibetan tradition, we hear an explanation of emptiness from the point of view of the Madhyamika Prasangika school, which is one of a number of schools. And there are people who, nowadays in the world, who hold the views of these other schools, so they would explain things in a different way.
The two truths belongs to one of the schools?
Well, actually all four schools talk about the two truths, but they would have somewhat different ways of explaining the two truths.
Also the teachers, I think it was in the text, I think Lama Zopa, if I'm not wrong, they were saying first you have to learn the lower, like the Hinayana, before you study the upper ones, so you can understand and go like a Greek, because otherwise if you don't understand those, you cannot develop your understanding.
Yeah, the analogy is like climbing a ladder or climbing stairs, or maybe going up in a building. Let's say a building. Okay, so you have a 4-story building, or 5-story or 6-story or whatever, yeah? So, you have to go gradually up to the top. Unless you're Superman, you can fly right up to the top. But most of us, we have to go gradually. So the understanding of the lower schools helps us progress to an understanding of the higher schools. So, yeah, in the monasteries, when the monks and nuns in the Gelugpa tradition study in the monasteries, they do study these 4 systems and debate about them and so on. So they get very, very familiar with their viewpoints, and that really helps them eventually when they study Madhyamika to understand that point of view. So last week I This naughty microphone. Maybe I just hold it. Well, anyway, we're going to have a break soon, but so last week, for those who, or not last week, last session, for those who are here, what we did was I gave a little bit of explanation about, and then we did a meditation on the one kind of selflessness of persons. If you look on page 2, right in the middle, letter G, it says 3 levels of selflessness of persons. And number 1 is very coarse. And this is the emptiness of a permanent, unitarian, independent self. So this is the most coarse or the most gross kind of selflessness that there is. All the Buddhist schools agree with this. They all agree that there's no such thing as a permanent, unitarian, independent self. And this was important in India because there were and still are today schools of philosophy and, meditation and yoga and so on that teach this kind of self. They call it Atman. So they believe there is such a thing. And perhaps if we come from a Buddhist or Jewish or Christian background, we might also have this kind of belief in a soul, something permanent, unchanging, eternal, independent, and so on. So this is like the most coarse or gross type of self that we need to look at. Is there such a thing as a permanent, unitarian, independent self? So Buddhism says no, it's just a fantasy, a creation of the mind. It doesn't really exist. But we might have such a view. We might believe in such a self. So we need to look at that and check. Do I think myself exists in this way? And if so, is it true? And so on. So we did some meditation on that last time. Today, we'll go on to the number 2, which is a course. It's still coarse, but it's less coarse than number 1. This is the emptiness of a self-supporting, substantially existent self. So before we go into that, let's take a break.
Okay.